Okay, so this discussion is going to be discussing some general guidelines for football and track. So this kind of starts our discussions that we have about the various sports. And again, just some of the little individual differences. We've kind of set up for this by talking about some of the general strength and power and endurance qualities that you see in some of the different sports. We're going to be talking about, and the way we're going to kind of break this down with these different sports is talk about even some unique training tools and modes of training that you can use that certainly can actually be applied to other sports. So they'll be talked about within the context of the whatever sport it is we're talking about. Again, in this instance being football and track, and I'll discuss why I'm talking about football and track in the same discussion. But you can add some, you could take away certainly some training modes and means of training and apply them to other sports as well. Okay, so as I discussed and described, we're going to be still bringing in some other concepts. So the concept of specificity, and again, this isn't unique to football and track. Obviously, it applies, but it will also work for other sports as well. You have to look at designing your training plan based on the needs of the sport. And this was discussed in some other classes. We have three types of analysis that you can do. You obviously do a movement analysis. So, you look at kind of the biomechanics of what goes on with the sport and what some of those demands are. You look at the positions the athletes get in, joint angles and things of that nature. And that can certainly be beneficial when you're trying to select training modalities for them. Look at the physiological analysis. So that would discuss and look at your energy systems. So we have our three primary energy systems and how do they all interact with each other. Remember we said that when you're designing the conditioning, you have to make sure you're designing your conditioning kind of based upon what the sports need and what they require. You can't hone in on energy systems and fatigue athletes in ways that they're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be fatigued. And then last, and probably, I would say again, I think one of the big things that you have to do when you're designing programs is look at injury prevention. Okay, that's one of the biggest things that you're looking to do in training. Look at what are common injuries that you see. Okay, so we look at different. We look at males and females. Just there, you tend to have different injury situations and different ways to prevent the injuries. Just even when you're looking at gender, but certainly when you're looking at sports, obviously, for instance, when we're talking football, there's going to be things unique to football and track that you could look to prevent versus some other sports, and even looking at different positions in the sports can tell you some things as well. The said principle is always going to apply. So the specific adaptation to impose demand. So that again, what the athletes do as a part of their training is going to impact what the adaptations they get. So make sure, again, going based upon our needs analysis and applying the right type of training means, and consideration for what time of the season it is. And your periodization models could help with that. So, look at what time of the season are you in. For instance, during the football season, obviously a lot of the general training is going to get scaled back. They may only strength train once or twice a week. Okay, and really from the standpoint of the strength and conditioning professional, aside from if the sport coach lets you be involved with the metabolic conditioning, which hopefully they are, but if they're not, you're probably just going to be more or less at that point monitoring the strength training. You tend not to do a lot of jumps and things like that as a part of their in-season training, because you really have to prioritize what they're doing for their general training, because most of their stress is going to be taking place on the field. Okay, still looking at the specificity concept, the concept of overload. So again, we're looking to train the system and create an adaptation. So you want to make sure that you're overloading the system in a way that their bodies, and again, making sure that you're incorporating the appropriate recovery and everything within that overload, and also proper progression. So I had mentioned the periodization models earlier, and we'll certainly have some discussions about, we've already had some discussions about periodization models, but we're going to look some more at some other types of periodization models and how we can apply these concepts both in season and during the off-season time frames. Okay, so one of the things you have to look at is, if we're looking at football positions, and I got this idea, the strength and conditioning coach for the Arizona Cardinals, Buddy Morris, very knowledgeable strength and conditioning coach. He's been at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's somebody who really provides a lot of good information. He said something really interesting during a presentation he once gave. He said, when you're looking at football players, train your down linemen like throwers, train your skill players like sprinters. And I thought that was really interesting, and I think there's some truth to that when you look at the requirements of those individual position categories. So train the down linemen like throwers. Again, down linemen don't have to do a lot of running, and in reality, they really don't have a running requirement. Now, when you're deciding how to make them run and everything else, even for conditioning purposes, you have to keep in mind, the down linemen, particularly if you're dealing with football at high levels, you're dealing with very large individuals that every time their foot strikes the ground, it's a pretty big stress to them. So if you're going to have them run, you got to kind of limit your distances for them. And obviously the skill players, you could pretty much treat like sprinters. Okay, so that would be like your wide receivers, your defensive backs, and your running backs. Now, here's where we get into where it might get a little trickier. So tight ends and linebackers are what you'd call combo players, or what I could remember when I played football, they referred to them as big skill players. Okay, so your tight ends, linebackers. You might even throw in, depending upon, again, sometimes you have to look at what your football team's strategies are, okay? So sometimes your edge rushers on your defensive line may even fall into this category. They may not be like you might want to not necessarily train them like classic down linemen. You may throw them into this category. But this would be your big skill. So here you're going to kind of combine both aspects of their training. So, and I would even say from the standpoint of strategy, when you look at the tight ends, how much blocking versus how much pass catching are they doing? If they are more of a pass catching tight end, you may have them do slightly more sprint work and things like that based upon what their needs are. And then you have your specialists like the punter and the kicker. Really the biggest thing for a punter and kicker is alactic power. They'll do some aerobic work just for health reasons and just for general cardiovascular fitness, which is good for everybody. But, for the most part, they're in alactic power position. They're coming in, they're kicking the ball with a lot of power one time, and that's something that you would consider as a part of your programming. Okay, so when we look at our track events, so you have your sprinting events, your 100, your 200, and your 400 meter. You have your hurdles, your 110 for the men, 100 for women in the 400. You have your middle distances, your 800, your 1,000, your 1,500, 1 mile, 3,000, and you also have the steeplechase, so there's some unique demands there. And then obviously you have everything beyond that would be considered your long distance events. And the other thing is there are some additional indoor events. You have to consider the 60-meter sprint for indoors. So this kind of outlines most of the events you would see. And again, you consider what your distances are when you're designing your programming, okay? Now, again, for track, it might be a little different. Obviously, a lot of their running is going to probably be programmed by the sport coach, but you should know how to train a sprinter for speed-based purposes. And that's going to be important for loading when you're considering some of the other things they're going to be doing. So a lot of the speed guidelines I'm actually going to give you on the next slide are really what you need to look at for your sprint work. and then we'll talk a little bit more about the applications and some further discussions as far as how you can set these different distances up. All right, so here are some really good guidelines. These are the speed guidelines from James Smith's Applied Sprint Training Manual. It actually comes also from Charlie Francis, who is a very good Canadian track and field coach. So these guidelines I'm going to give you again are kind of based off of higher level track sprinters. So obviously, like for instance, if you're working with youth athletes, these guidelines may have to be adjusted. So there's both time frames and distances because of the fact, again, you can't always necessarily take things from higher level, track athletes who have more experience and always necessarily apply them to younger individuals. Okay. So here's kind of the breakdown. So alactic speed, you need to consider acceleration as part of this. Okay. Most acceleration that's going to take place occurs in 30 meters or less, okay? Now, high-level track athletes will reach their maximum speed usually 60 to 80 meters out, but still most of that acceleration is going to occur in the first 30 meters. Females will typically hit their max speed earlier than males will. So your alactic speed, typically less than 8 seconds or less than 80 meters. Again, most of the acceleration, regardless how far out someone can accelerate, will be in the first 30. When you're considering field sport athletes, most field sports, most of the sprinting that takes place within 30 meters. So again, acceleration is going to be an important aspect to work on for most of your field-based sports. And field-based athletes tend to hit, they tend to hit their I'm sorry, they tend to hit their max speed around 30 to 60 meters. So your alactic speed, less than 8 seconds, less than 80 meters. When you're talking speed endurance, you're talking between 8 to 15 seconds and 80 to 150 meters. Okay, so that would be your speed endurance. Your special endurance 1, 15 to 45 seconds, or between 150 and 300 meters. And then your special endurance 2 is less than 45 seconds, around 300 to 600 meters. Okay, so these are kind of your guidelines when you're setting up your speed work as far as how you want to break down your speed work and your distances. Now, for non-track athletes, there's no instance in which a sprint is sustained, beyond alactic speed. You don't have a direct speed endurance and special endurance per se, because the sprints never last that long in field sports for non-track athletes. However, the speed endurance and special endurance can still be used. Typically, you'll still split them into shorter distances, but they can be used to enhance rhythm and relaxation in running. Okay, so one of the things we talk about with speed work is that speed and running shouldn't be done and look like it's very stressful. If you watch athletes that are really fast, they're very fluid. They don't show a lot of tension when they run, and that's what the longer distances can do. So there is still application for these. Okay, it's just in a bit more of a general sense, but it can definitely help with that rhythm and relaxation. Okay, looking at some of the other track events, you have your throws and jumps. Again, these are going to be primarily alactic power-based, so it's going to be really important when you consider these. You have your shot, your hammer throw, your discus and javelin, and then you have your jumps. You have the pole vault, the high vault, the triple jump, and the long jump. These are just some of the other events. Again, when you're looking at these events, again, every athlete to a degree gets benefit from doing some general aerobic work because, again, just for health purposes and recovery. But these athletes should not be doing a lot of, again, distance running and things like that for that purpose. Remember, in class, we've discussed that, to train yourself aerobically, you don't have to just do distance running and long, slow duration type work. You can do other things to address that. And we'll certainly have some other examples of that in further discussion. So if you're going to talk about track and field, the short to long and long to short concept. So this refers to the distances that athletes will start at in their running and progress over the course of the training year. So if you're in the short to long category, your distances start short and you gradually go longer. If you're in the long to short, it happens just the opposite. So this again is another concept put together by Charlie Francis. He designed the whole short to long, long to short thing based on other experiences. And there's a pro and con to each, and we're going to talk about what you're usually looking at. For the most part, when you're talking field-based sports, you're usually going to go short to long. Now, again, there's some types of athletes that might benefit from going long to short. They typically say the more muscular the athlete, the more they benefit from a short to long, which short to long is classically when you look at sprinting and track and field, that's what like your 100-meter runners do, and they tend to be more muscular athletes. So they tend to benefit from a short to long. More ectomorphs tend to benefit from a long to short. So the ectomorph is the longer, leaner type build from the standpoint of, kind of how they're built. So they tend to benefit more from the long to short. There's also other classic means. Now, if you want to do a long to short with, say, a field sport athlete, and you don't necessarily want them to per se run long distances, there's other ways to do that. Hills and sled sprints are a good way to start long to short because the distances don't necessarily have to be really long, but because with hills and sleds you have resistance, either through the external resistance of the sled or the natural resistance of a hill, the actual duration of the run as far as time-wise gets extended. So the time gets extended while the distances could still stay shorter. You could still work within 30 meters, but that could still be considered a long to short if you start the athletes on that early in the season, and then you'd gradually work away from those resistant type sprints through those means, and then gradually start to shorten your distances. So again, there's different ways to do this. It's not there's not a one size fits all for everybody. Again, classically, for most of your field sport athletes, you would use the short to long approach, which would be used for your short sprinters in track. There are some instances where you might go the long to short, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to incorporate hills and sled sprints to kind of address that. Okay, just some other things to note as far as football is concerned. So again, football is an alactic aerobic sport, meaning that the alactic system generates the primary sport activities, and the aerobic abilities are there to help with recovery in between events. So, you're going to be looking at improving alactic capacity and alactic power. So if you kind of go back to our previous talks on how to do that. So, because again, the importance here is the ability to recover between plays and series. You also have your aerobic capacity, which is going to be important because that's what's going to allow you to recover. And again, we said extensive tempos are really the way to do that. And if you're going to have your big down linemen running, making sure that you're limiting the distance that they run. It's a good rule of thumb that if you're gonna work tempos into the football and you are going to have the down lineman run, you're probably going to want to keep them to about a 50-meter interval. Okay, so in other words, 50 meters will be the longest they will run at any one clip. Really to have them run beyond that is probably a little stressful and probably unnecessary when you're doing that. Other ways that you could address aerobic capacity besides the extensive tempo, there's abdominal circuits. You could do medicine ball circuits that are of low intensity, and you could repeat longer warm-ups. If you want to incorporate a longer warm-up, particularly early in the off season to help with general conditioning, that will help. And even just strength circuits in general. There's ways you can do strength circuits appropriately, and I'm not necessarily talking a circuit where they're hitting weights and at each station they're going to failure. Okay, there's ways to constructively do that. And we actually talk about the strength aerobic method in one of the other discussions on one of the other sport-focused discussions. Glycolytic training, there's little contribution to the demands of the sports. The glycolytic system really does not work during football. Again, if you kind of look at the energy system demands, and you'll occasionally get the person that will say, well, what happens in the case they have to go no huddle or a 2-minute drill? Here's what I would say to that, and I think there's agreement on this, even with individuals who have worked extensively with football. If you train the alactic and the aerobic system properly, you don't have to worry about the glycolytic system, because those energy systems will work more efficiently and effectively when they're faced with that. So there's other people have talked about this being anti-glycolytic. In other words, not worrying about the glycolytic system, because by training the alactic and the aerobic properly, you don't have to worry about the hydrogen ions starting to form from what happens with that intermediate energy system. Okay, the importance of low intensity cardiac. So we talked about the low intensity cardiac work in the discussion on endurance training. And we did mention these benefits, but again, for these athletes, it would help. So the low intensity cardiac work, improved immune function, improved parasympathetic tone. I had mentioned how, making sure they're parasympathetic at rest, being pro-circulatory, improved function of the circulatory system. It's just going to allow them to recover from their hard training a lot faster, and in general lower their levels of cortisol. So cortisol is a catabolic hormone. So particularly for these athletes who are, in some case maybe really looking to build muscle, in the case of the big players, the down linemen, lowering cortisol levels will also help in their recovery from training. Again, the incorporation of jump exercises. So again, you're going to improve a lot of different things depending upon the types of jumps. So remember, we said depending on how you do your jumps and what type of jumps you select, you can improve different skills. In other words, you could kind of shift the focus a little bit. Obviously, primarily when you're using jump exercises, you're looking to improve explosive strength and reactive ability, but you can also improve maximum strength with jumps. And you can kind of shift the emphasis to maximum strength with jumps. For instance, we talked about depth jumps, for instance. Well, typically the higher the box, the more you're going to improve strength qualities from the transition from landing to jumping. Now, you still don't want to come off too high of a box, because if you're having to catch yourself too much and you're kind of breaking up that amortization phase too much, you're not going to improve anything, and you're probably putting too much stress on the system. You can also use it to improve local muscular endurance and anaerobic power, and then just your coordination of movement and force efforts. So again, a lot of the stuff we talked about with jump exercises, and again, strategically kind of pick your jumps based upon, you can look at the positions the athletes are in. Also look at what other things they're looking to improve. So for instance, if they're in a phase of training, look at your skill athletes. We said train them like sprinters. You're training your skill athletes like sprinters, okay? If they're working more on acceleration, consider using jumps that go through larger ranges of motion and knee joint angles. Whereas when they start to work a little bit more towards max speed distances, then start to have them become a little bit more reactive based and working at smaller joint angles. So little things like that, just to have all your training coincide, gets to be very important. So it's important to be able to look at a jump and think what qualities you'd have your greatest carryover to. Okay, another thing kind of taken from Charlie Francis you can look at is your running intensities. We've discussed this before. Again, high intensity, everything in the 95th percentile and up. So again, it's increased CNS demand. Okay, this is where you're really going to be utilizing the central nervous system and really improving speed. Okay, so here you're going to be improving your speed qualities when you're doing this in that high intensity range. You're going to need at least 48 hours to recover from this, so you have to keep that in mind with your other training modalities when you're setting up your programming. The medium intensity, which again, this is the area where sometimes, particularly with conditioning, coaches tend to spend too much time in. This is in that, 76 to 94 percentile. It's too slow to be specific to the training objective. The other drawback to it is that you have to consider it high intensity because you can't recover from it in less than 48 hours. So every time you do medium intensity running, you're taking away from high intensity stuff. So if you're going to incorporate for whatever reason, and there are some times where you may do it, but the thing you have to understand is if you're doing medium intensity running, you can't do high intensity running, or you have to at least take away, I shouldn't say you can't do it, you have to take away from the overall volume. Then you have your low intensity. So these are your tempo runs, different forms of active recovery. And so I'm going to give you some of the upper ranges of volume for some different athletes. So when we look at football, for instance, your defensive backs and wide receivers could be somewhere in the 1,600 to 2,000 meter range. Your running backs and linebackers between 1,200 and 1,600. Your big athletes, you're going to be less than 1,200 meters overall volume. I forgot to mention this earlier with the core. I kind of left the quarterbacks out of interestingly enough, out of the discussion when I was talking about it. I'm just realizing it now. When you look at quarterbacks, again, where you're going to place your quarterbacks is going to be dependent upon what type of quarterback they are and what type of scheme you're running. So, for instance, if you're looking at the quarterback, if you're running more of like you run a lot of option, the quarterback is a quarterback that's going to be responsible for running the ball more. You're going to train them more like the skill athletes. If you have more of a classic drop back passer, which is typically a bigger quarterback, that type, you'll actually train them similar in theory to the down linemen just because they don't have running. They won't necessarily do all the same strength training the down linemen will do, particularly with like a lot of heavy pressing movements because you want to be mindful of their shoulder health. But that's how you'd break up the quarterbacks based on your strategies. As far as your track athletes with the tempo run, short sprinters, their volume could be around 1,000 to 2,000 meters. If you run 400 meters or more, you could get into the 3,000 meter range for your overall volume. I'm going to go over some other ways that you could kind of track the volume. There's some tricks if you look at time motion analyses with other sports that you can use to kind of determine your overall running distances. And again, consider non-running tempo for your athletes, in this case down linemen in football, who don't have a running requirement. Okay, again, it's not wrong to have them run. If they are going to run, keep the distances limited, and make sure that you're keeping the overall volume in check while they're doing that.